welcome back to Piper versus YouTube channel where curiosity meets the code. Today we'll be discussing about how to create a multi-threaded URL link checker with the help of a GUI window. But before that, we'll be checking the packages pre-installed in my system. So the first command that I'm going to execute in command prompt is pip list, where you can see all the packages with the versions so I can give a look about what package is what version and update it accordingly. So you can take a look onto your packages. If not installed, please do install it. You can just Google how to install and there will be a command for that to execute in command prompt. Another command to check for all these is pip freeze, which gives a similar output where packages with the version will be mentioned. So let's get started with a code of how to check the URL using a GUI window. So starting for few of the functions. So Tkinter is used for GUI, which is graphical user interface, and request library is used for making HTTP requests, and threading module for working with the threads, and the queue is the data structure for managing data between the threads, and date time module for working with dates and time. Moving on, we have a function to check the URL, and the second function to process the queue, and the third one to start the checking of the process, and the fourth one is to update the results. And later down we have few code for displaying of the main window, URL entry, thread count entry, and check button. So let's understand the code with the first function, which is define check URL. So what happened to this is, first of all, it defines a function called check URL that takes a URL as an input and attempts to check its status. Records the start time before sending a head request to the URL, sends a head request to the URL, and records the end time upon receiving the response. It also calculates the response time in milliseconds. And later on, I've given a if-else module. This checks the status code of the response. If it's 200, it puts a tuple containing the URL active status and response time into the results queue. Otherwise, it puts a tuple with the URL, the status code, and the response time. And we have an except statement where catches a connection error exception. If the problem connecting to the URL, it puts a tuple containing the URL connection error status and none to response time to the result queue. Let's move on to the next function, which is process the queue. Now what happens in this loop? It starts to process URL from the URL queue, and it retrieves the URL from the queue and checks its status using the check URL function, marks the URL as the processed using URL queue task done. Now let's move on to the next function, which is start checking. So what happens here? It defines a function of start checking to initiate the URL checking process, and also it's creating a global queue, which is result queue, to store the result in. And also it retrieves the URL from the input text area, which is the URL entries there. Na? Splits them by a new line and adds each URL to the URL queue. So there is a URL queue also. Then for the for loop adds a centile value which is none to the URL queue for each thread to signal the end of the URL processing. And then we have result text, config, delete, and config. So this configures the results text area, which is result text, to allow modification, clears its contents, and disables the modification. And then again, there is a for loop which starts multiple thread to process the URL queue. Currently, each thread runs process queue function, and we have a root dot after 100 dot update results. This schedules the update result function to be called after 100 milliseconds, which is even less than a second, using Tkinters after the method. Now let's move on to the next function, which is update results. Now, what happens in update result? It defines a function result update to update the result text area with the URL status and response time. Then continuously process items from the results queue until it's empty. Then insert the URL status and response time if available into the result text area. And also it configures the result text area to allow modifications, disable the modification after updating the marks and the task as done. Last but not the least, it schedules itself to be called again if there are still active thread processing the URL. Let's see how we can create a GUI in the next part of the code, which is to create the main window. So root.tk.tk, it helps us to create the main window using Tkinter, and also the title is also given as the URL link checker. And the next is URL entry, where it creates a URL text area where users can put URLs and adds it to the main window. And next we have thread count entry, where it creates a label called thread count label and an entry field called thread count enter for specifying the number of threads to use for URL checking. Next, we have initialized a check button, wherein which if you click, it starts the checking of the URL, and also the button is padded with 5 units. And going on to the result text area, this function creates a text area which is result text for displaying the URL statuses and response time and adds it to the main window. Initially, it's configured to be read only, which is disabled. And then we have a queue for the URL for storing the URLs to be checked. Finally, we have the code to start the Tkinter loop with the GUI process. Quickly, let's see the output of the program. So I usually copy the name of the file.py, open command prompt from there, and Python space the file name dot py. So you can see there is a GUI appearing, and I'm going to copy a URL randomly and paste it in the above box and given the check count and check for URL. So it will show you that the status is active and the response time taken is 1330. I have given your thread count as 5. You can change it to whatever number you want to. Thank you so much for watching. If you have learned something from this video, please do consider giving it a like, share, and subscribe. to our channel and keep supporting. Thank you.